السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. لعل اليمن يمثل تحديا قاسيا للولايات المتحدة الأمريكية وبريطانيا بنحو خاص، اللتين تعدان حليفتين رئيسيتين للتحالف بقيادة السعودية، والمؤيدتين لهذه الأعمال العدائية التي تسحق على نحو ممنهج ومتكرر القانون الدولي، وتدمر الاقتصاد الوطني اليمني وموارده وحضارته وأهله، وتجوع أطفاله عمدا وتقطع آمال جيله الشاب. مع الأستاذة الأمريكية البريطانية مندي نتحدث من الداخل عن استراتيجيات التحالف في العدوان على اليمن وعن الحرب الغذائية. معكم زينب صفار، تابعونا. لعل العالم لم يتأثر بمآسي مئات الآلاف أو ملايين السوريين من قتلى ومهاجرين جراء الحرب العالمية على سوريا، لكنه اهتز وانتفض لفاجعة الطفل إيلان عام 2015. بحسب علماء النفس، من الصعب على العقل البشري استيعاب كارثة آلاف القتلى، فيصرف النظر عنها ويرجعها إلى عوامل جغرافية سياسية وصراعات اقتصادية، ويصبح موت الملايين أو الآلاف مجرد إحصاء عدد لا أكثر ولا أقل. ويوجد تفسير أو مصطلح علمي لهذه الظاهرة بحسب خبراء النفس، وهو انهيار وتلاشي الرحمة. وهذا لا يعني أننا منعدمي الإحساس تجاه موت مليون شخص بحسب علماء النفس، ولكن لخوفنا من تصور موت مليون شخص مرة واحدة نلجأ إلى ما يسمى الدفاع الوقائي وفق المراقبين. بكل الأحوال، لعل التحالف بقيادة السعودية في عدوانه على اليمن وأهلها لسنوات قد استفاد حتى من تلك الظاهرة بدعم من الولايات المتحدة وبريطانيا وفرنسا لإجراءاته العدائية والوحشية. فاليوم يوصف اليمن عموما بأنه أكبر أزمة إنسانية في العالم، إذ إن 80% من سكانه يحتاجون إلى مساعدات غذائية، حيث أصبح الغذاء سلاح حرب. ومع ارتفاع أسعار الغذاء والوقود، باتت هذه الحرب تهدد بفناء جيل كامل من أطفال اليمن الذين يواجهون تهديدات متعددة، من القنابل إلى الجوع إلى أمراض يمكن الوقاية منها مثل الكوليرا التي أضرت بأكثر من 1,000,000 شخص. ولا تشمل أسباب ذلك آثار حملة القصف على نوعية وكمية الطعام والماء المتاحين فقط، ولكن قبل كل شيء تأثير الحرب الاقتصادية المتفاقمة منذ أواخر عام 2016. مندي الباحثة البريطانية والأستاذة الفخرية في الأنثروبولوجيا في كلية لندن للاقتصاد، والعضو المؤسس لمجموعة ثمار البحثية التي أجرت العديد من الأبحاث الميدانية الأرشيفية في اليمن والأردن وسوريا ولبنان، وكتبت حول قضايا في علم الإنسان تكشف من الداخل عن فحوى ونتائج تقريرها الجديد بعنوان استراتيجيات التحالف في حرب اليمن، القصف الجوي والحرب الغذائية، والذي تقدم فيه بيانات ورسوما فريدة من نوعها، حيث تعرض تحليلا شاملا لأنماط استهداف المواقع المدنية وتأثير حملة قصف التحالف بقيادة السعودية والإمارات العربية على إنتاج الغذاء وتوزيعه في المناطق الريفية اليمنية، وعلى صيد الأسماك على طول ساحل البحر الأحمر.
It's very kind of you to say that, and I think in a sense that is true. There was a real failure of the provision of information by the great powers and also even by the UN agencies for the first year and a half of the war. And so one began through links with Sana'a and with its institutions to try to put together and to make available information that was beginning to come out. And that first took the form of the work that was done by the extension officers of the Ministry of Agriculture and Irrigation.
MAI,
yes, MAI, in documenting things that concern their ministry that had been hit, particularly by coalition bombing. And so one started to analyze that from the spring of 2016, and those runs go only through August 2016. Then one brought in what became available from September 2016 and is still ongoing, which is the data of the Yemen Data Project, which is a group of volunteer human rights people inside Yemen and logging local journalists and other sources about what has been targeted on a given day. And finally, we have complemented that with a very important report that was done in early 2017 by the Water and Environment Center of Sana'a University onto Wadi's systems, to agricultural systems in the Tahama, which is presently so much under
We will talk
threat.
about this particular case.
And finally, the work of a young Yemeni scholar, Ammar al-Farah, which is soon to come out through London School of Economics, my university, with the Middle East Center, on the nature of artisanal fishing in the Red Sea, and based on primarily data but from the Ministry of Fish Wealth, how the targeting of the fishing sector in the Red Sea and marketing. But he also did interviews with traders, with fishermen themselves, etc. But that report is yet to come out, but I include a very broad overview from that one.
Why have you underlined, ma'am, the fishing sector?
Well,
in addition to the agricultural
because after oil, the largest export of Yemen, by the way, before the war, was fish. And particularly if one looks at Tahama, the two major food sources and economic activities were, aside from the processing of food and light industry, were agriculture and artisanal fishing. Also, these are two sectors in which the population is really very poor and suffers historically also from economic exploitation. And I had myself worked in the Tahama in Wadi systems in the mid-70s and through to the early 80s, and was already alarmed at the types of development projects being pushed by the World Bank and other agencies at that point in time. So I've just given an overview of the sources, but the purpose of the report is to make some of this visible through graphic interpretation, that is through mapping and charts, because this war has been, it's often said, the forgotten war, but it's also been an invisible war. Really, and I think it's also been somewhat of an invisible or an unintelligible war for Arab audiences as well as audiences outside.
Here, ma'am, let's talk about the figures and the graphics, as you mentioned, very important graphics that you have displayed in the report, Professor Mata. I want you to illustrate, please, and tell us what's so striking about these graphics.
Well, it depends which. I think that what is very striking with the Yemen Data Project, which the logging of which continues to today, is the relationship between civilian strikes and military strikes over the long period, in which one can see a whole number of months in which the number of strikes on civilian targets was considerably higher than those on military targets. And yet there is a pattern to that, and it is that pattern that the body of the report tries to make sense of. That is on the one hand. On the other hand, and it was that first drew my attention to what the war could represent for food production in Yemen, were the data that is laid out in a whole series of maps in the report from the ministry, the MAI, the Ministry of Agriculture and Irrigation.
Sure.
And that put side by side with the Yemen Data Project allows one to see for the first year and a half of the war, which is really very kinetic in nature, what were the shifts? Because I think we can later come on to what is, in a sense, not possible to put in graphics, which is the economic war. But combining the Yemen Data Project data with the MAI data, one saw that indeed the war had, it is said, had been promised to its backers in the West to be a short war. And so it began with very major strikes on military targets from late March through to early August. But by that time it was okay. There was an agreement whereby Saleh, Abdullah Saleh's linked troops, but also the parts of the army and the Houthis withdrew from Aden under that pressure. But beyond that, there was absolutely no surrender. So therefore, they started to adopt other policies. It is clear from the pattern of striking, and that is what is the point of mapping. One needs to distinguish between different areas of the country, right, over time.
Exactly.
Because clearly, I mean, all of the areas that came under the Emirates and the Saudis, I mean, there was a great deal of fighting around Mareb, so at certain points in time, there were a lot of strikes there, but eventually Mareb established its own government, its own bank, under kind of Saudi
control.
Saudi-linked control. And so then that goes out of the picture. But the focus has been on the areas under the control of the de facto government in Sana'a, let's just call it that way, because even the UN, in the UN Human Rights report, called it the de facto powers in Sana'a. So I won't get involved in the nomenclature for the government based in Riyadh, but we can call it that because that's by now a UN term also. Because one needs to bear in mind that it's not just the Houthis, even it is parts of the Yemeni army and the popular committees that are fighting. So let's say the de facto government in Sana'a has been the major objective, but that means that the areas from, nevertheless, the areas from which the Houthis themselves came, that is to say, the governorate of Sada, joining the present border with Saudi Arabia, began to be targeted right across the rural areas as early as June 2015. And that's what the MAI started to show. When the rest of the country, it was random. Some things were hit, but it would be difficult to say there was any. It was systematic targeting of food production. But from the middle of August, that kind of pattern became much more generalized throughout the areas under, with different intensities, under the control of the de facto government in Sana'a, and that is, and there one sees that they were hitting elements in food production, even fields and chicken farms and flocks and tents, but also all of the markets, food trucks, water and ancillary things, water systems.
And this is what's adding to the case of Yemen today. Then this is leading Yemen more and more towards coercive famine and starvation. Allow us, Dr. Martha Mundie, to stop for a short break, and then afterwards we're going to highlight more the issue of coercive starvation. إذا فاصل قصير ونعود، لا تذهبوا بعيدا.
وفقاً لآل ثورنينغ شميت الرئيسة التنفيذية لمنظمة أنقذوا الأطفال الدولية، فإن ملايين الأطفال لا يعرفون متى أو إذا كانت وجبتهم المقبلة ستأتي في اليمن. مارثا مندي الباحثة البريطانية التي أجرت العديد من الأبحاث الميدانية الأرشيفية في اليمن والأردن وسوريا ولبنان تقول إن هذه الحرب دفعت البلد إلى حافة المجاعة، مع ما يقدر بنحو 22 مليون شخص في حاجة إلى المعونة الغذائية. لكن هل بات الشعب اليمني اليوم على شفير المجاعة أم إنه يعاني فعلياً من التجويع القسري؟
There is at present, I gather, being done by the under the coordination of the office, the UN Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, surveys in order to actually declare famine. The statistical requirements are very high. Notably, there has 2 deaths per 10,000 persons every day, and as well as very high levels of severe acute malnutrition. Therefore, one has had the situation whereby, because of the problems of data production in the middle of a war zone, there has been a problem for the UN in saying, we have cases of starvation, we are on the brink of, we know because of distribution of food, roughly what proportion of the population requires food. But it should be remembered in this very important point about starvation. It takes a long time to starve someone to death. Usually this only really happens in situations of imprisonment. Usually people die from ancillary diseases along the way. Right.
Yes.
And so this business of the question of the fact that it takes time to starve someone means that the authorities who are behind the coalition strategies have plenty of time to know what some of the impacts of their policies are. Right. And I think one should...
So was that a strategy of the Saudi-led coalition?
Well, I think that from the autumn
we will starve them, and then when they subdue, we will just feed them.
Well, this is the dream. We've seen this elsewhere. We see this. This is. But people do not actually, or particularly those fighting back. It does not leave people in the way, not to so to speak, in Iraq before the American invasion, not in Gaza. It does not lead people into the. But it's always the dream of those who would resort to such things, that people, and this horrible phrase that was often used, Yemen will collapse. What on earth does that mean? It means nothing. But it's this mental state of those waging war with in a vengeful manner. Now, I think it's very important to bear in mind that it is not only the kinetic strikes, it is the economic war that was launched from the autumn of 2016, which is because all great famines in the modern period are political in nature and linked.
Sanctions and related also to economic problems.
Of course.
They are just political in nature, and they target actually the people.
I mean, it's not targeting those who are decision makers. We will talk a bit about Tehama. I mean, of all areas, this is the one where, men do not carry knives and do not carry guns. This is the most
And you've
peaceful.
been there.
Of course, I've been there. I was back there in 2011 for a period of time, too. I mean, and these are some of where there has long been problems because of gross inequality as well, problems of access to food among the poor. And they are actually in the heat of kinetic war as the Emirati-backed forces with the Saudi Air Force at present are trying to take the city of Hodeidah so as to choke off the mountains completely. But let's go back to the economic war, because we got on to where we are in the limited, in very important kinetic war that's barely being talked about today around the port of Hodeidah once again. The economic war is very important to bear in mind. First, the central bank was moved to Aden, out of Sana'a, even though it had been paying employees right across the country and government employees and social payments right across the lines of fighting. Once it moved to Aden, it ceased to pay people in all of the government employees, which includes health workers, teachers, army, etc., right across the areas controlled by the de facto powers in Sana'a. Secondarily, in a very irresponsible manner, ordered a lot of money from Russia, from the private company that prints Yemeni rials, at a time when, and this relies on journalistic reports, I don't have the data in hand exactly, very little of the oil revenues of Yemen are actually going into the central bank itself. So there was very little to underpin. And so since September, we've had a crash in the value of the rial, which means that the poor absolutely can't buy. And finally, and the size of this we don't really know, there has been a great deal of sending back to Yemen Yemeni laborers that were working in Saudi Arabia as part of the policy of Saudiization of the labor force, also imposing very high residence permit fees all of a sudden, so that hundreds of thousands, so that the remittances that were coming back from Yemeni labor have also crashed. You put all these things together, and plus the blockades on particularly the port of Hodeidah that have made food so expensive, and you have a full-blown economic crisis for anybody but the very rich. Anyone who is hungry is innocent.
So one last word, Dr. Mata Mandi, what about the future? How do you see the future of Yemen?
Well, I think that the only hope is that the Houthis and many of the forces who are really fighting on the Sana'a side, they are not fueled by oil money. They come from the Yemeni countryside. And what will need to be adopted is a total change in economic policy, and from that was dominated by the World Bank in decades under Ali Abdullah Saleh, because it was well estimated by Peter Salisbury, a distinguished journalist, that for every dollar that came in aid, $3 were going out to financial paradises under the regime of Ali Abdullah Saleh. That kind of opening needs to stop. There are beginning to be moves of revaluation of the particularly of basic food production in Yemen. But I also, since it is the two of us who are women, I think that in the last decades, the women's issues, women's questions, women's education and family planning in the positive way that Iran once did, are all very necessary for Yemen. But that requires universal health coverage at the most basic level to be introduced. So yes, Yemen has a future. It has a future. It has a future in that the Yemenis work.
And the
Yemenis
people,
work, the Yemenis study. You have a totally different kind of society than you have in the oil soaked societies. But it needs to build from the ground up and to receive actual help, not just conditional, quote-unquote aid, which in fact had led, it was one of the major factors in the crisis that we see that led up to the war.
Dr. Mata Mandi, Professor Emeritus of Anthropology at the London School of Economics and a founding member of the Thimar Research Collective. Many thanks indeed, ma'am, for joining us, for your insights and for this comprehensive report.
Thank you, and thank you for drawing attention to it, since it was the work of myself and my colleague, the cartographers.
Yes, it's our duty, ma'am. Thank you again.
Thank you.
إذن لقاء جديد في الأسبوع المقبل مع ضيف جديد وقضية جديدة ودائما من الداخل. للمزيد من التواصل بريدنا theinside@almayadeen.net وصفحتنا على الفيسبوك من الداخل. من كل فريق عمل البرنامج من كل الميادين، السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.